The living room was quiet except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Garland stared at his laptop, trying to focus on the numbers on the screen. He had been working late from home more often lately, diving into spreadsheets for hours as a way to ignore the growing tension in his life. Jenny's had been different for weeks now. She was always busy, making excuses, coming home late with flimsy reasons, errands, work meetings that ran over, a spontaneous dinner with friends. But the pieces didn't fit. Garland had asked her once, casually, if everything was all right. "I'm fine, Garland," she had said, not looking up from her phone. "Work's just been a lot lately." She hadn't even glanced at him, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen as if it were more important than their conversation. The evening came. She left the house, saying it's an important meeting. Tonight was no different. The house was empty, quiet, and Garland found himself thinking again about the subtle changes, how she seemed to drift further away with each passing day. Her laughter was forced, their conversations brief and superficial. He had brushed it off at first, chalking it up to stress or midlife weariness, but the gnawing suspicion wouldn't let go. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting him from his thoughts. He grabbed it, frowning when he saw it was Jaden calling. "Hey, son," Garland answered, trying to sound casual. "What's up?" The panic in Jaden's voice was immediate. "Dad, you need to listen to me. It's about Mom." Garland straightened up, alarm flashing through him. "Jaden? What's going on? Where are you?" Jaden's voice was shaky, breathless. "I saw her, Dad. I saw Mom at the Ocean View Hotel with Mr. Smith." "Mr. Smith?" Garland felt his stomach tighten. The name hit him like a punch. Mr. Smith, their new neighbor. They had only moved in 2 months ago, a friendly enough man, always waving when Garland mowed the lawn, occasionally chatting with Janice when she was outside watering the plants. Nothing about him seemed unusual. Garland's mind raced, trying to catch up with what Jaden was saying. "Are you sure, Jaden? What were they doing?" There was a pause on the other end, and then Jaden's voice broke, heavy with something between shock and disgust. "They were together, Dad. I followed them, and they're doing things I can't even explain. I didn't know what to do, so I recorded it. I'm sending you the video now." Garland's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at his phone screen, waiting for the video to come through. He didn't want to believe it, he couldn't. But there was no reason for Jaden to lie. His hands trembled as the video notification popped up. His breath caught as he opened it. It was worse than anything he had imagined. The camera was shaky, but there was no mistaking the figures. Janice, his wife of 20 years, wrapped around another man. Their embrace was intimate, full of passion. Garland's mind went blank for a moment, the world around him dissolving into nothing. He replayed the video, hoping he had seen wrong, hoping this was some kind of horrible mistake. But it wasn't. The reality was as clear as the screen in front of him. The woman he had trusted, the mother of his child, had betrayed him in the worst way. He sat there, frozen. The air in the room felt thick, heavy. His mouth was dry, and a sour taste lingered in the back of his throat. His mind screamed for him to react, to do something, anything, but all he could do was watch, feeling the weight of the betrayal crush him. Seconds felt like hours before he could speak again. "You did the right thing. Good job, son," Garland finally said, his voice steadier than he felt. His brain raced, formulating a plan, even as his heart ached. "Come home. Right now." Jaden hesitated. "What are you going to do?" Garland's jaw tightened. His emotions swirled between hurt, anger, and a cold resolve. "We need to give her a reality check. I have a great plan." Jaden was silent for a moment, but then he muttered, "Okay, Dad. I'll be home soon." Garland hung up, placing the phone down with deliberate care. His mind was already racing through the next steps. There was no point confronting Janice tonight, not with the raw anger coursing through him. He needed to think clearly, not act impulsively. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing she had shattered his world. No, he would make her feel the full weight of her betrayal, but on his terms. He stood up, pacing the living room. Every memory of their life together, their wedding, the birth of Jaden, the trips, the laughter, the love felt tainted now. Every moment, every smile was a lie. He could barely contain the anger rising in his chest. But he couldn't afford to lose control. Jaden arrived home an hour later, his face pale, his hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets. Garland was waiting for him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, staring at the divorce papers he had pulled from the drawer earlier. "Dad," Jaden started, his voice quiet, unsure. Garland looked up, meeting his son's gaze. "You did good, Jaden," he said, his tone measured. "I'm sorry you had to see that." Jaden shook his head. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did the right thing," Garland repeated. He reached out, putting a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "This isn't your fault. It's hers. But we're going to handle this smart. We're not confronting her. Not yet." Garland sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. He could hear the front door creak open and then the familiar shuffle of Jaden's footsteps. It was past midnight, but neither of them had time to think about sleep. There was too much to be done. Jaden walked into the kitchen, looking uncertain. Garland gestured for him to sit down. He could see the tension in his son's face, the confusion in his eyes. Jaden sat, fidgeting with the zipper on his jacket. "Dad, what's the plan? What are we going to do?" Garland's eyes darkened as the plan started to solidify in his mind. "We're leaving, Jaden. First thing tomorrow. When she comes back, she'll find this house empty, our accounts cleared, and divorce papers waiting. She's going to feel what it's like to lose everything. That's just the start." Jaden blinked, absorbing the weight of his father's words. "Just leave? But what about? She'll have nothing. No explanation. No warning. She'll feel the same shock I felt tonight," Garland said, his voice cold and certain. "She won't get away with this." Jaden nodded slowly, understanding. "Okay, I'm with you, Dad." Garland leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. "We're not going to confront her. Not yet." Jaden frowned. "But why? Shouldn't we tell her we know?" "No," Garland's voice was firm, though not harsh. "That's what she'd expect. A fight. Drama. We're not giving her that. She needs to feel the consequences of her choices, and she's not going to see them coming." Jaden nodded, but the frustration lingered. "I don't get it. What's the point of waiting?" Garland's eyes were steady, his mind clear. He hadn't felt this kind of clarity in weeks, maybe months. "The point is to make her understand what she's done. Tomorrow, when she comes home, the house will be empty. Everything gone. She'll have no idea what happened, and no way to fix it. She'll feel what it's like to lose everything without warning." Jaden stared at him, absorbing the words. "You mean we're leaving? Just like that?" "Yes," Garland said, standing up. "We pack tonight. By the time she gets home tomorrow, we'll be long gone. She'll have the divorce papers waiting for her, but nothing else. No money, no family. She'll know exactly what it feels like to be blindsided." Jaden swallowed hard. "And after that?" Garland paused for a moment. "After that, we disappear. We start fresh. Just you and me." Jaden took a deep breath, his fists clenching on the table. "Okay, let's do it." Without another word, Garland walked over to the hallway closet, pulling out a couple of suitcases. Jaden followed, grabbing boxes from the garage. They moved with quiet purpose, filling the house with the sound of packing, drawers being emptied, items being stuffed into bags. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. In the bedroom, Garland stood over the dresser where Janice's jewelry and clothes were neatly arranged. He stared at them for a long time, wondering how long she had been planning her betrayal, how long she had lied to his face. He grabbed one of her necklaces, dangling it between his fingers for a second before dropping it into an empty box on the floor. Across the hall, Jaden was in his room, methodically packing his things. He yanked clothes from his closet and shoved them into a duffel bag, his face set in determination. Occasionally, he'd glance at the phone on his bed, the one he had used to record the video, but he never picked it up. The anger in him simmered, but he focused on packing, just like his dad. The kitchen was next. Garland opened the cabinets, pulling out dishes, cups, and silverware. He stacked them in a box, making sure to leave nothing behind. As he worked, he found himself thinking back to the last few months, all the little signs he had ignored. The late-night errands, the sudden change in Janice's mood, the way she seemed distant, even when they were in the same room. He had wanted to believe it was just a phase. Now he felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. Jaden walked in, dragging a suitcase behind him. "This is everything from my room. What do we do with the rest of the stuff? We're not taking everything, Garland said, looking around. Just what we need. The rest can stay. She'll come home to an empty house, and it'll hit her harder than if we took it all. Jaden nodded again, though the tension in his face never left. What about the money? Garland turned to his laptop on the kitchen counter, tapping a few keys. Already done. I transferred everything out of the joint accounts. She's not getting a dime. Jaden blinked, impressed. You already thought of everything. Garland glanced at him. I've had time to think. For the next few hours, they continued packing in silence. The house felt emptier with every box they moved, the once familiar space now barren and lifeless. By 4 a.m., the living room was stripped bare, the kitchen cabinets empty, the closets cleaned out. All that remained was the divorce paperwork on the counter, along with a single note. You made your choice. Garland stared at the note for a moment before placing it next to the papers. It was simple, direct, just like what Jenny's had done to their marriage. No long explanations. No emotional speeches. Just the cold, hard truth. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, Garland and Jaden stood by the front door, looking back at the house one last time. The rooms they had lived in, laughed in, shared so much of their lives in, now felt like a shell. Jaden looked at his dad. You sure about this? Garland's jaw tightened. We're sure. Jaden gave a small nod. All right. They walked out, closing the door behind them without a second glance. Garland's truck was parked in the driveway, packed to the brim with their things. He climbed into the driver's seat, Jaden settling beside him. The engine rumbled to life, and they pulled out onto the road. The early morning mist hung low over the street as they drove through the quiet neighborhood. The houses they passed by were still dark, their occupants unaware of the storm brewing behind one of the closed doors. As they hit the highway, Garland glanced over at Jaden. You okay? Jaden shrugged, staring out the window. I don't know. I'm still angry. You should be, Garland said simply. But we're not going to let that anger control us. We're in charge now. Jaden looked at his dad, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I get that. The miles stretched out in front of them, the road leading away from everything they had known. The house, the neighborhood, the life they had once shared with Jenny's, it was all behind them now. Ahead of them was the unknown, but Garland felt a strange sense of relief. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. As they drove further into the morning light, Garland reached over and turned on the radio, the soft hum of music filling the truck. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a deep breath. There was no more waiting, no more suspicion, no more doubt. They were moving forward, and Jenny's would wake up to the consequences of her actions. Jenny's pulled into the driveway, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin as she parked the car. The wild night before had been exhilarating, filled with moments of passion and excitement she hadn't felt in years. She and Mr. Smith had shared secrets, laughter, and stolen kisses. It was intoxicating, and for a moment, it felt like she had escaped the monotony of her life with Garland. But as she reached for the door handle, a chill crept up her spine. The house was unusually still. The air felt different, heavy somehow. Janice opened the front door, her smile fading as she stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the eerie silence. There was no sound of Jaden's music blasting from his room. No noise from the TV in the living room where Garland would usually sit. She frowned, closing the door behind her and calling out, Garland? Jaden? Her voice echoed through the house, but no one answered. She took a few steps forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The usual clutter was gone. The shoes by the door, Jaden's backpack tossed carelessly on the floor, Garland's keys on the table. Everything was empty. Her heart began to race as she made her way down the hall, her stomach tightening with each step. She entered the living room and froze. The furniture was gone. The couch, the coffee table, even the framed photos on the wall had disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat. Garland, she called again, louder this time, the panic rising in her voice. She rushed into the kitchen, hoping to find some sign of life, something to tell her this was all a mistake. But the kitchen was just as barren. The cabinets were open, shelves emptied, and on the counter sat a single envelope. Divorce papers. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, eyes scanning the words that seemed to blur before her. And then she saw it, the note, written in Garland's familiar handwriting. It was short, brutal, and to the point. You made your choice. Jenny stumbled back, the note slipping from her fingers. She clutched the edge of the counter to steady herself, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of sick joke. But the empty house told her otherwise. Everything was gone. They were gone. No, 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 she muttered under her breath, pacing the kitchen. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat growing louder in her ears. She grabbed her phone, dialing Garland's number with shaky fingers. The phone rang once, twice, and then went straight to voicemail. Garland, please. Call me back. Where are you? What's going on? Her voice cracked as she left the message, her chest tightening with each word. She hung up and immediately dialed Jaden's number. It too went straight to voicemail. Jaden, baby, please just call me. Tell me where you are. Tears welled in her eyes as she left the message, her voice trembling. She stood there for a moment, staring at her phone, hoping, praying that one of them would call her back. But the screen remained dark and silent. Panic set in. Her breathing became erratic as she dropped the phone on the counter and stumbled into the living room, her eyes darting around the empty space. How could this have happened? She had been careful. Garland wasn't supposed to know. He wasn't supposed to leave. Jenny sank to her knees in the middle of the room, her hands clutching her hair as tears spilled down her cheeks. The reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. Everything she had taken for granted, Garland, their life together, their home, it was all slipping away. How had it all gone so wrong? She replayed the past few weeks in her mind. The late-night rendezvous with Mr. Smith, the secret phone calls, the lies she had fed Garland about work and friends. She had convinced herself that it was just a harmless affair, that Garland would never find out. She had been so sure of it. But now, as she sat on the cold, empty floor of her home, she realized just how wrong she had been. Her phone buzzed on the counter, jolting her out of her thoughts. She scrambled to her feet, rushing back to the kitchen, hope flickering in her chest. Maybe it was Garland. Maybe it was Jaden. But it wasn't. The screen lit up with Mr. Smith's name. For a moment, she hesitated. The excitement she had felt last night was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. She answered, her voice barely above a whisper. Hello. Hey, gorgeous. I've been thinking about you all day. Mr. Smith's voice was smooth, but the sound of it made her stomach turn. Something's happened, Jenny said, her voice shaking. Garland, he knows. They're gone. Everything's gone. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean, gone? I came home, and the house is empty. He left me divorce papers. He took everything. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Mr. Smith was silent for a moment before he spoke again. Okay, calm down. We'll figure this out. Maybe it's not as bad as it seems. It is, Jenny whispered, her tears flowing freely now. He's gone, and Jaden, he won't answer my calls. They've left me. She could hear Mr. Smith sigh on the other end, his tone more serious now. All right, just sit tight. We'll talk later. I've got some things to deal with on my end. The call ended, leaving Jenny standing alone in the kitchen. She stared at the phone in her hand, the silence of the house surrounding her like a suffocating blanket. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had always thought she had control, that she could balance the affair and her marriage without consequence. But she had underestimated Garland. She had underestimated the depth of his hurt, his anger. She looked around at the empty house, her home, now just a shell of what it once was. Every piece of furniture, every photo, every memory was gone, just like the life she had known. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, and for the first time, she felt the full impact of what she had done. Jenny sank to the floor once more, her body trembling with sobs. She had thought she could have it all, the thrill of the affair, the comfort of her family, but now she realized she had nothing. Everything she had taken for granted was gone, and there was no one to blame but herself. As she sat there, the tears streaming down her face, she knew that this was just the beginning of the consequences she would face, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to survive them. The days after discovering the empty house blurred into a nightmare for Janice. Each morning she woke up hoping it was just a bad dream, but the cold reality slapped her as soon as she opened her eyes. The house was still bare, Garland and Jaden were still gone, and her phone remained silent except for the occasional sympathy call from a clueless friend. Janice tried everything to reach Garland. She called, texted, emailed, even drove to places he used to frequent, but it was like he had vanished off the face of the earth. Each time she dialed his number, it went straight to voicemail. The first few times, she left tearful messages, begging for him to talk to her, to give her a chance to explain. But as the days wore on, and the silence stretched longer, her desperation morphed into something darker. A feeling of helplessness settled over her, weighing her down. Her savings account had been cleaned out. Garland had left her with nothing, no money, no access to joint finances, and no way to sustain herself. Panic gripped her as she visited the bank and found that every account was empty. She sat across from the bank manager, who offered a look of professional sympathy, but his words stung. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter, but your husband withdrew everything. There's nothing left in the joint accounts." She left the bank in a daze, barely able to comprehend how completely Garland had cut her off. The house seemed colder when she returned, its emptiness a constant reminder of her mistakes. Meanwhile, the world around her was beginning to crumble in ways she hadn't anticipated. News of the affair had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. It seemed that someone had leaked the details to everyone, though she couldn't figure out who. Janice received cold stares at the grocery store, whispered conversations stopped abruptly when she walked past, and neighbors who used to greet her with friendly smiles now turned their backs. But Janice wasn't the only one paying the price. One evening, Mr. Smith came home from work, completely unaware that his life was about to implode. He walked up the driveway, carrying his briefcase, whistling a tune, and thinking about how he'd call Janice later that night. But as he approached his house, he saw his wife, Laura, sitting on the porch, divorce papers in her hand. She didn't even look at him as he approached. The tension in the air was palpable, and Mr. Smith's smile faded quickly. "Laura, what's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. She finally lifted her gaze to him, her eyes red from crying, her expression hardened. "I know everything," she said, her voice flat and cold. "The affair. You and Janice. You destroyed our marriage." Mr. Smith froze, his mind racing. "Wait, Laura, listen. Don't," she interrupted, standing up and holding the divorce papers out to him. "You've humiliated me. Our neighbors know. Our friends know. And now our marriage is over. This is the last conversation we're ever going to have." He tried to explain, to offer some excuse, but Laura turned and walked inside, leaving him standing alone on the porch, the divorce papers in his hand. His world crumbled in that instant, and he knew there was no salvaging what was left. At work, things weren't much better. News of the affair had spread to his colleagues, and in the days that followed, he found himself increasingly isolated. His reputation, once built on professionalism and respect, was now tarnished. Clients began to withdraw, and the partners at his firm made it clear that he was no longer welcome. His career, his life, everything he had worked for was falling apart piece by piece. For Janice, the only thing that remained was the crushing weight of her own guilt. Each day, she woke up to an empty house, the sound of silence pressing in on her. She thought about Garland constantly, about Jaden, about the life she had destroyed with her choices. The regret gnawed at her. But no matter how much she wished she could turn back time, she knew there was no undoing what had been done. One evening, as she sat alone in the darkened living room, her phone buzzed on the table. Janice's heart leapt as she saw Garland's name flash across the screen. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the phone, quickly answering. "Garland," she whispered, her voice shaky, filled with hope and fear. There was a long pause on the other end before his voice came through. It was cold, distant, and unrecognizable. "Janice." Her breath caught in her throat. "Garland, please, we need to talk. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Didn't mean for what had happened, Janice." His voice was low, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "You didn't mean to destroy our family?" You didn't mean to lie to me for months? You didn't mean to betray me and Jaden? I was confused. I was lonely. Jenny stammered, tears streaming down her face. I made a mistake, but please let me explain. Let me fix this. There was a long silence on the other end, and Janice's heart raced, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. You didn't make a mistake, Janice, Garland finally said, his voice colder than ever. You made a choice. You chose to cheat. You chose to lie. And now, you're going to live with the consequences of those choices. Garland, please, she started, her voice cracking. There's nothing left to say. Jaden and I are moving on. We're building a life without you. You'll never see us again. The finality of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. You can't do this, Garland. Please, I'm begging you. I'm done with you, Janice. Goodbye. The line went dead. Janice stared at the phone, her hand still gripping it tightly, as if willing it to ring again. But the silence on the other end told her everything she needed to know. Garland was gone. Jaden was gone. And she was alone. She dropped the phone on the floor, her body collapsing onto the couch as the sobs racked through her. Everything she had taken for granted, her family, her marriage, her life, was gone. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, suffocating her. And for the first time, she realized just how deep the consequences would go. There was no fixing this. There was no going back. And now, all she had left was the hollow ache of regret and the cold emptiness of a house that no longer felt like home. Weeks had turned into months, and with each passing day, Janice's life unraveled further. The initial shock of Garland and Jaden's disappearance had long since faded, replaced by a relentless gnawing despair. Her days blurred together, a routine of waking up alone, facing the empty house, and staring at her phone, hoping for a call, a message, anything from her son or husband. But the silence was all-encompassing. She tried to reach out to Jaden, calling him, sending him messages, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and desperate pleas. But Jaden had cut all ties, and it was as if she had been erased from his life. The realization crushed her. She couldn't bear the thought of her only child hating her, and the guilt consumed her. Each time her phone went unanswered, the void in her heart grew deeper. One night, Jenny sat on the couch, staring at a half-empty glass of wine, her mind racing through the same thoughts she had every evening. What if she had never started the affair? What if she had told Garland the truth before he found out? What if she had been a better wife, a better mother? Her fingers hovered over her phone, scrolling through the last text message she had received from Jaden months ago. I don't want to see you again. Please stop contacting me. The words stung as sharply now as they had when she first read them. Jaden was her last hope, her last connection to the family she had destroyed. She couldn't lose him, not forever. Driven by desperation, Janice began searching online for any clue about where Garland and Jaden might be living. She had been through this routine 100 times before, but tonight something different happened. She stumbled across a local news article that mentioned a man by the name of Garland Carter buying a house in a nearby town. Her heart leapt into her throat. It was him. She was sure of it. Over the following days, Janice became obsessed with the discovery. She drove past the address several times, each time trying to summon the courage to knock on the door. She rehearsed what she would say over and over in her head, imagining every possible scenario. She knew it was a long shot, but she had to try. She had to see them again, no matter the cost. Finally, one evening, after days of indecision, she couldn't take it anymore. She pulled into the quiet neighborhood, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The house was small but cozy, with a well-kept lawn and a row of flowers blooming along the driveway. She could imagine Jaden inside, maybe watching TV or playing video games. The thought brought a lump to her throat. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and approached the front door, her heart racing. She stood there for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorbell, frozen in place. What if Garland refused to talk to her? What if Jaden slammed the door in her face? But she couldn't back down now. She had to try. With trembling fingers, Janice knocked on the door. A few moments passed, and then she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there he was, Garland. He looked different, stronger somehow, more self-assured. He stood in the doorway, his expression cold and emotionless as his eyes met hers. He didn't speak. Janice's breath caught in her throat, her mind scrambling for the words she had rehearsed so many times. But when she opened her mouth, all that came out was a choked sob. "Garland," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, please, we need to talk." Garland's face remained stoic, his eyes hard as stone. He didn't say anything, just stood there, waiting for her to continue. "I know I messed up," Jenny stammered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I made a horrible mistake. I was selfish, I was stupid, but I didn't mean for things to end like this. Please, Garland, don't take Jaden away from me. Don't leave me like this." Her words came out in a rush, her desperation spilling over. She wanted to explain everything, to make him understand how lonely she had been, how lost. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that none of it mattered. Nothing she could say would undo the damage she had caused. Garland's silence was deafening. His expression never wavered, his eyes never softened. "You didn't just make a mistake, Janice," he finally said, his voice cold and steady. "You made a choice. You chose him over us. The day you walked into that hotel, you walked out on this family. Don't come here and pretend like you're the victim." His words cut through her like a knife, and Janice felt her legs give way beneath her. She collapsed to her knees, clutching the edge of the door, her sobs racking her body. "Please, Garland," she begged, her voice hoarse. "I can't live like this. I'll do anything. Just let me see Jaden. Let me be a part of his life. I can't lose him. I can't lose both of you." Garland looked down at her, his face unreadable. He let the silence hang between them for a moment before speaking again. "You already lost us," he said quietly. "The moment you betrayed us, you lost everything. And now, you're going to have to live with it. Just like we did." Jenny shook her head, gripping his pant leg in desperation. "No, please, Garland, don't do this. I've changed. I'm sorry. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I'll do anything. Just give me a chance." Garland gently pulled his leg away from her grasp, taking a step back. "It's too late, Janice. Jaden doesn't want to see you. And neither do I." Her heart shattered as she looked up at him, her tears blurring her vision. "Please, I can't live without you." Garland's eyes flickered with a hint of sadness, but his resolve remained firm. "You'll learn to live with it, just like we did." Without another word, he stepped back and closed the door, the finality of the moment hitting Janice like a tidal wave. She was left on the porch, her body trembling with sobs, her heart breaking all over again. The door was shut, and with it, any hope of reconciliation. As she sat there, her tears falling onto the cold concrete, the reality of her situation sank in. She had lost everything, her family, her son, her marriage, and there was no way to undo it. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, suffocating her. Jenny sat there for what felt like hours, her sobs echoing into the empty night. She had nothing left but her regret, and for the first time, she truly understood the depth of the consequences she had created. There was no forgiveness coming, no second chances. Garland and Jaden had moved on, and she was left behind, alone with her guilt. The sun filtered through the curtains of Garland's new home, casting soft light across the room as he sipped his morning coffee. It had been nearly a year since he left everything behind, since he and Jaden had driven away from the house that once held their family's memories. The wounds of betrayal had run deep, but time, coupled with the new life he was building, had helped him heal. Garland had found peace in the stillness of his new life. No more late-night doubts about Janice's whereabouts. No more lingering uncertainty when she'd come home with distant eyes. His new home was smaller, cozier, and more importantly, free from the toxic weight of Janice's betrayal. The neighborhood was quieter here, the people kind, and the pace of life slower. It was exactly what he needed. After the initial chaos, Jaden had adjusted well too. They had forged a new routine, father and son navigating the aftermath together. It wasn't easy at first. There had been sleepless nights, difficult conversations, and a lot of silent car rides. But the bond between them had only grown stronger. Garland glanced at a framed picture of him and Jaden on the mantel. The photo was from Jaden's first day of college, a bright, clear day full of hope. Jaden had his arms slung around Garland's shoulder, grinning ear to ear, his excitement about the future palpable. For Garland, that moment marked the start of something new, a life where he could focus on his son and himself. Jaden thrived in college. He'd always been a smart kid, but after what happened with Jennings, his focus sharpened. The hurt of his mother's betrayal had transformed into a kind of motivation, an unspoken pact between him and Garland to never let anything like that break them again. Every weekend, Jaden would come home for a visit, and they'd talk late into the night about his studies, his plans, and the kind of future he was carving out for himself. One Saturday, as Jaden walked in through the front door, Garland was sitting on the porch, enjoying the breeze. "Hey, Dad," Jaden called out, dropping his backpack by the door. Garland looked up with a smile. "Hey, kid, how's it going?" Jaden plopped down next to him, a look of contentment on his face. "Good. I'm doing really well. Just had a midterm, but I think I crushed it." Garland chuckled. "That's my boy. Told you all those late-night study sessions would pay off." Jaden nodded, but there was something more on his mind. After a pause, he looked at his father and said, "I've been thinking, Dad, about how things turn out. With Mom." Garland set down his coffee, his expression turning thoughtful. "What about it? I guess I just wanted to thank you," Jaden said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You could have lost it after everything that happened, but you didn't. You stayed strong for me, and I know that wasn't easy." Garland placed a hand on Jaden's shoulder, squeezing it gently. "You're my son, Jaden. You're the most important thing in my life. After what happened, I knew the only way forward was to make sure you had a stable home, somewhere we could rebuild. I couldn't let what your mom did tear us apart." Jaden smiled, grateful for his father's words. "I know, and I'm really lucky to have you." The conversation felt like closure, an acknowledgement of how far they'd come since that terrible day. As Jaden spoke about his plans for the future, Garland felt a profound sense of pride. He hadn't just survived the storm that Jennings' betrayal had caused. He had built something better out of the wreckage. Meanwhile, Jennings' life had taken a far different turn. After Garland and Jaden left her, she had been forced to face the consequences of her actions. At first, she tried to keep up appearances, pretending that everything would somehow return to normal. But reality soon caught up with her. Her affair with Mr. Smith, which had once seemed thrilling and passionate, quickly unraveled. Without the secrecy and the thrill of sneaking around, their relationship was hollow. They argued constantly, the guilt and shame of what they'd done hanging between them like a fog. Mr. Smith, whose life had been just as devastated by the fallout, eventually left Jennings. His own marriage had crumbled, and his career suffered due to the scandal that had leaked to the neighborhood. Jennings found herself completely alone. The house she once shared with Garland was now a painful reminder of what she had lost. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every empty room echoed with memories of the family she had torn apart. She tried to reach out to friends, but word of her affair had spread, and many of them distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the situation. The sense of isolation was suffocating. In the months that followed, Jennings attempted to move on. She tried dating again, but every relationship fizzled out, haunted by her past choices. Men who initially showed interest would withdraw once they learned about her affair, and the few who stayed never connected with her the way Garland had. The loneliness grew unbearable. Occasionally, Jennings would sit in front of her phone, staring at old photos of Jaden and Garland, replaying memories of family vacations and holidays. She would wonder how things might have been different if she had made different choices. The pain was relentless, but there was no escaping it. The life she had known, the love she had taken for granted, was gone, and there was no undoing what had been done. One afternoon, Jennings walked by a park where she used to take Jaden when he was a little boy. She stood by the swings, watching a father pushing his young son, laughing together in a way that twisted her heart. It reminded her of the life she used to have, the one she had so carelessly thrown away. As she stood there, lost in thought, she realized that Garland and Jaden had moved on without her. They were thriving in a life she no longer had access to, a life she had chosen to leave behind. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. For Garland, the pain had faded into a distant memory. His new life, built on honesty and trust with Jaden, had become the foundation of his happiness. He no longer thought about Janice in the same way. The anger had long since dissipated, replaced by a calm understanding that life had moved on, and so had he. In the end, the consequences of Janice's actions were clear. Some things, like trust and family, once broken, cannot be mended. The betrayal had left scars, but for Garland and Jaden, those scars had healed, allowing them to build something stronger. For Janice, however, the wounds remained open, a constant reminder of what she had lost. And as time continued to pass, Garland found peace in the knowledge that he had done the right thing. He had protected his son, reclaimed his life, and created a future full of possibility. The betrayal was a chapter of his past, but it no longer defined him. His life was his own again, free from the shadows of Janice's mistakes. And in that, he found his own version of happiness.